They insult you, and instead of defending yourself, you respond with something like, "Yeah, that might be true." No tightening in your voice. No effort to recover status. No performance of dignity. Just a quiet agreement that feels almost too simple. In that moment, something subtle changes in the interaction. The attack loses its direction because it is no longer meeting resistance. What used to feel like pressure now just hangs in the air without landing. Most people misunderstand this completely. They assume insults are about truth or accuracy, when more often they are about steering your emotional response. The hook only works if you bite. When you don't react, you remove the steering wheel from the other person's hands. There is a strange clarity in that moment, because control was never in the words themselves, but in your need to defend against them. This pattern shows up in multiple places. When someone points out a flaw in your work, the impulse is to tighten, explain, correct. When uncertainty shows up, you rush to sound certain. When emotion rises, you try to manage how it looks instead of what it is. Even agreement itself becomes a tool, not as surrender, but as a way of diffusing the need for control. Over time, this becomes less about isolated moments and more about a pattern of identity pressure dissolving across different environments. From conversations with colleagues to disagreements in close relationships to the internal dialogue when no one else is watching. So, before the techniques begin, the instruction is simple. Notice the next time someone inflates a flaw, and instead of correcting it, let the sentence stand and respond with something like, "I have done worse in other situations." Then, stop talking. The silence that follows is where the pattern breaks. And everything that comes next builds from that interruption. Identity pressure shows up most clearly when reputation feels like something you have to actively protect. The moment someone questions you, the instinct is to tighten your story, to correct their version, to pull perception back into alignment. It feels like control, but it is actually dependence showing itself in real time. The more force you use to defend it, the more you reveal how much it matters. The Stoic view cuts underneath that reflex. Reputation is not a possession sitting inside you. It is a moving projection formed in other minds. Once you treat it as something external, it stops behaving like property and starts behaving like weather. You can respond to it, but you cannot own it. That distinction changes the emotional math immediately. From there, the transparent sovereign position becomes clearer. Nothing essential is hidden because nothing essential is being staged for approval. There is no internal committee constantly editing expression to avoid misinterpretation. Even mistakes lose their threat because they are not tied to identity preservation. Marcus Aurelius operated from this angle, not by managing how he was seen, but by managing how he judged what happened. Epictetus sharpened it further, pointing out that what is true does not become more dangerous by being spoken aloud. That removes a large category of anxiety that normally drives defensive behavior. There is a slight discomfort when this is first applied, because letting perception float without control feels exposed at first. But that discomfort is temporary, and what replaces it is a system with fewer pressure points. What follows is how that system gets structured into repeatable principles that hold under stress. Identity pressure shows up most clearly when reputation feels like something you must constantly defend. The instinct is almost automatic. Someone points at a flaw and you rush to correct the record. Tighten your image. Restore balance. But in that movement itself, you reveal the dependency. The more you fight to preserve perception, the more fragile it appears. Preemptive shadow ownership interrupts that loop before it locks in. Instead of waiting for someone else to define your weak points, you surface them first in a calm, matter-of-fact way. Not as confession, not as apology, but as simple acknowledgement of what already exists in your pattern. The effect is subtle but immediate. Resistance collapses because there is nothing left to push against. In practice, this can feel slightly counterintuitive at first. If someone says you were careless in a meeting, the reflex is to defend context, explain intent, reframe the outcome. But a different response sounds more like, "That is fair. I have been careless under pressure before, and I am working on reducing that." No emotional tightening. No attempt to reclaim superiority in the moment. Just placement of truth without inflation. A colleague might push further and point out a missed detail. Instead of escalating into justification, you might say, "You are right. That has happened when I am moving too fast." And then you stop. What follows is usually a drop in intensity because there is no longer a story to attack or defend against. This is not self-criticism, and it is not passive agreement. It is controlled ownership of narrative before it becomes distorted externally. Over time, something practical becomes obvious. People cannot easily manipulate what you have already integrated. Control increases the moment you stop treating identity like something that has to be defended in real time. When there is nothing constantly being protected, the mind has more space to operate instead of react. That space is where intellectual humility stops being a liability and starts acting like leverage. You are no longer forced into rigid certainty just to feel stable. Instead of locking into a fixed position, you allow partial uncertainty to exist without panic. It is a small shift in language, but it changes the tone of the entire interaction. Saying something like, "I might be missing something here," removes the need to perform certainty while still keeping your mind engaged. The situation stays open instead of becoming a contest. There is a noticeable effect on the other person as well. When you are not presenting a hardened position, they lose the clear surface to push against. The conversation becomes less about breaking your stance and more about examining the situation together. It reduces the pressure on both sides without any explicit effort to calm things down. In a work setting, this shows up when a decision is questioned. The instinct is to defend logic, justify sequence, reinforce authority. But a different response might sound like, "I could be wrong here. I will take another look." It feels slightly uncomfortable at first because most environments reward certainty as a signal of competence, even when that certainty is artificial. Still, once the tension drops, something more useful appears. The conversation shifts from winning to refining, and, over time, people tend to trust the person who can stay flexible without collapsing into doubt. Identity loses control the moment it stops reacting automatically under pressure. When that reflex breaks, the system becomes harder to predict, and that is exactly where stability starts to form. Most emotional influence depends on people snapping back on cue, like a well-worn circuit. When that circuit fails, the leverage disappears without any need for confrontation. Between what happens to you and what you do next, there is a small gap. It is barely noticeable at first, but that gap is where control actually lives. In practice, this means someone can make a sharp comment, something designed to get a rise, and instead of answering immediately, you let it sit for a second. You notice the impulse, but you do not move with it. In a group chat, this might look like a message that lands with a slight edge, and instead of replying instantly, you wait and then respond with something simple like, "Not sure that needs a response right now." It feels slightly unnatural at first because silence now reads as deviation from the expected rhythm. People are used to instant emotional return, not space. That pause changes the structure of the exchange. Escalation loses its fuel because it depends on momentum. In a meeting, this shows up when someone challenges your decision, and instead of defending or correcting immediately, you let the statement hang for a moment before speaking calmly. The room adjusts around that stillness. What is happening is not suppression. It is separation from automatic response. You are still aware, still present, but no longer carried by the emotional current itself. There is a small but real shift in positioning, like stepping half a pace out of the stream and watching it move instead of being inside it. Over time, people begin to unconsciously recalibrate around that. The predictable reaction they expect is no longer guaranteed. When you stay unhooked emotionally under pressure, something important opens up in the interaction. You are no longer trapped in the reflex to correct, defend, or restore your position. That creates room to influence the shape of the conflict itself, rather than just reacting inside it. The shift is subtle, but it changes the entire direction of the exchange. Strategic agreement neutralization works through that opening. Instead of pushing back against a claim, you absorb part of it in a controlled way, so the emotional structure that supports escalation loses tension. Most arguments need resistance to stay alive. When resistance is removed, the argument has nowhere to go. In practice, this often sounds almost too simple. Someone says you are unreliable, and instead of denying it, you might respond, "Yeah, I can see how it could look that way in certain situations." You are not confirming the entire narrative. You are just refusing to wrestle it into a fight. That small adjustment changes the physics of the moment. There is an initial friction here because it feels like you are giving ground. Most people are trained to believe that any agreement equals loss of status. But in this context, agreement is not surrender. It is selective acknowledgement used to stop escalation from forming a stable target. For example, in a meeting, someone points out missing details and you respond, "That is fair. I have missed things under pressure before, and I am working on tightening that." The temperature of the room drops almost immediately because there is no longer a fixed point of resistance to push against. This does not mean you validate everything said about you. It means you refuse to supply emotional fuel through denial. Over time, people adjust their approach because they learn that escalation does not produce the reaction they are expecting. When external narratives lose influence, it is because they stop finding friction inside you. No internal resistance means nothing for the story to latch onto, nothing to amplify, nothing to destabilize. That is where something more structural becomes visible. Not a reaction, not a defense, but a steady internal reference that holds regardless of how events are described from the outside. That structure is what can be called the inner citadel. It is not built by ignoring feedback or filtering out criticism. It is built by separating interpretation from identity. Instead of adjusting your sense of self every time new information arrives, you keep a fixed point of reference and evaluate from there. The difference is subtle at first, but it changes how pressure behaves around you. In lived terms, this shows up as a quiet internal statement that does not need verbal expression. Something like, "I understand what happened here, and that understanding is not changing based on how it is framed elsewhere." There is no urgency to defend it because it is not unstable in the first place. Most people reverse this process without realizing it. They build identity outward, letting feedback define shape and meaning. Here the direction flips inward first. Then outward interpretation becomes secondary. That inversion reduces the need to constantly correct how things are perceived. In practice, imagine someone publicly misrepresents a decision you made. The instinct is to immediately fix the record, to restore alignment between perception and intent. Instead, there is a pause. Not suppression, but containment. You already know where you stand internally. So the external distortion does not create movement inside you. There is a slight discomfort in this because silence can resemble passivity at first glance, but over time it becomes clear that nothing essential is being lost. A colleague might repeat a distorted version of your actions, and you notice there is no internal shift in response. The story exists outside you, but it does not enter. What changes is not the behavior of others, but the dependency on their framing. Urgency dissolves because stability is no longer negotiated externally. When internal stability is in place, the urgency to defend yourself externally drops because nothing in the moment feels like it can destabilize who you are. The situation still matters, but it no longer feels like identity is on the line. That is what makes a different kind of response possible. One that changes the structure of conflict instead of getting pulled into it. The agreement protocol takes that internal condition and turns it into a simple spoken move. Instead of resisting a claim, you locate a small portion of it that could be true from a certain angle. Acknowledge it without tension, and then stop. No expansion. No correction spiral. No attempt to regain narrative control. Just a controlled acknowledgement followed by silence. In practice, this is surprisingly minimal. Someone says you are unreliable, and instead of building a defense, you respond with something like, "I can see why it might look that way in some situations." Then you let it sit. Nothing more is added to stabilize or repair the image. There is an initial friction to this because it feels like you are stepping back from a fight you are expected to win. Most people are conditioned to believe that not correcting a statement means accepting it fully. But here the effect is different. The absence of resistance removes the structure the conflict depends on. In a working environment, this might show up when a colleague says, "You are disorganized." Instead of listing explanations or context, you say, "That is fair. I have had moments like that, especially when things are moving fast." And then you pause. The interaction often ends sooner than expected because there is no longer anything to escalate against. This is not agreement as submission. It is agreement as deactivation. You are not validating the entire frame. You are removing the emotional fuel that keeps it active. Over time, it becomes automatic, and conversations stay grounded even when pressure increases. Internal triggers only become useful when they are no longer hidden in automatic reactions. The moment you start noticing them in real time, external conflict loses a large part of its grip. What used to feel like other people pushing your buttons becomes a clearer view of your own internal wiring responding under pressure. That shift is where real control starts to form. Tool 2, Shadow Audit Practice, begins from that exact awareness. Instead of treating emotional reactions as something to suppress or fix, you start treating them as data. Every time you feel a spike of defensiveness, irritation, shame, or the urge to justify yourself, you pause long enough to register what actually happened inside you. Not the story you told, but the raw trigger underneath it. In practice, this can be simple and slightly uncomfortable at first. Someone questions your work, and instead of immediately responding, you mentally note the first internal movement. Tight chest. Urge to explain, subtle embarrassment, or sudden need to prove competence. You do not act on it yet. You just observe it as a pattern rather than a problem. There is a friction in this process because it feels unnatural to slow down something that is usually instant. Most people live inside their reactions without ever naming them. Here you start separating experience from identity. The reaction is happening, but it is not defining you in the moment. For example, after a tense interaction, you might quietly register, "I felt shame when my decision was questioned," or "I noticed urgency to defend my competence when I was interrupted." No judgment attached, just recognition. Over time, these notes begin to reveal repetition, showing you which situations consistently activate defensive identity structures. This is not about over-analysis. It is about visibility. Once patterns are visible, they stop controlling behavior unconsciously. And once that happens, even emotional triggers begin to lose their automatic authority. Removing emotional resistance is not passive surrender. It only looks like that when you measure strength by visible struggle. When you stop pushing back against every trigger, it can seem like you are giving up ground, but the internal mechanism is completely different. What is actually happening is precision. You are no longer spending energy stabilizing an image under pressure, which means your attention stays available. That availability creates a different kind of control, one that does not depend on escalation or defense to maintain itself. This is where most misunderstandings come from. People expect strength to look loud, corrective, or resistant. So when they see calm agreement or emotional non-reaction, they assume nothing is happening. But internally, something important has already shifted. The system is no longer reactive, it is selective. There is a slight friction in practicing this because social environments often reward visible pushback. If someone misreads you as passive, there is a temptation to overcorrect. But that overcorrection is exactly the loop this approach removes. In real situations, this shows up as steady presence while others cycle through escalation. You are still engaged, still aware, but not pulled into identity defense. That difference is subtle at first, then becomes obvious over time. Once this reframing holds, the methods that came before stop feeling like techniques and start feeling like default behavior under pressure. Watching exchanges where agreement replaces defense, the dynamic shifts almost immediately. People stop pressing for reaction, and the interaction begins to recalibrate itself. There is usually a brief, awkward silence because the expected resistance never shows up, and that gap feels unfamiliar. In that space, the conversation turns less emotional and more factual, revealing how little escalation depends on anything outside your response. And it naturally points toward the final integration practice that brings all of this into consistent daily behavior. Real change only becomes visible when you stop treating it as theory and start observing it in live interaction. Over the next 7 days, the focus is simple: track identity pressure as it shows up in real conversations. Each moment is data, not judgment. You are not fixing yourself in real time, you are learning what actually happens under pressure. Start with a basic log. After each charged interaction, write what was said, what you felt, and whether you defended, agreed, or stayed non-reactive. For example, someone critiques your work, and you note the trigger, the impulse to defend, and whether you used agreement or silence instead. There is an awkward phase here because you are effectively watching yourself behave in real time, which can feel unnatural at first. But that distance is what creates insight, because patterns become visible instead of automatic. By day 3, you notice repetition, the same comments producing the same reactions. By day 5, the response slows because awareness interrupts the loop. By day 7, you see your identity defenses as a system rather than a self. This is the shift from understanding to living inside the model, with feedback. Next, everything consolidates into a final integration of how stability holds under pressure. What you just practiced is not a mindset shift, but a change in where identity sits under pressure. When that position changes, the need to defend image loosens and responses become simpler. You stop negotiating with perception in real time and start observing behavior as it happens. That is where transparency, non-reactivity, agreement, and internal stability begin to merge into one operating condition. It is not about being calm all the time. It is about noticing the moment you begin to tighten and choosing a different response. There will still be friction, especially when silence feels exposed or agreement feels unnatural. But that friction is part of rewiring the loop rather than avoiding it. From here, the only useful move is repetition in ordinary conversations, letting the pattern replace the reflex. Carry that into your next interaction and stay with what is actually happening instead of what your image wants to protect in real-time decisions moving forward.